Ready? Hi, my name is Chris Agee. I'm the editor and publisher of the Irish Pages Press, Cloan Mhíl Buí, an all-Ireland press and journal based in Belfast. Welcome to the launch. Welcome to the launch of this remarkable anthology. Please excuse the lack of finesse with Scots, perhaps. Clad with clouds, she came. 60 lyrics frae the Chinese. Kathleen Jamie and Brian Holton truly need no introduction, so I will dispatch with them. But let me say something about the journal and press. Some of you will be aware of the journal for the last 20 years. We published occasional titles, and in the last 2 years we've transitioned to a press publishing 8 titles a year and 2 issues, 2 of which will usually be from Scotland. I'll read just something on the press. Brian's book appeared in late 2022, and this is the formal launch of the book. Currently, the Irish Pages Press is limited to poetry, essays, memoir, and other forms of nonfiction, including the graphic novel form in English, Irish, and Scots. The Irish Pages Press will always be characterized by 2 essential and necessary components, flowing from the outstanding standards of the journal in an age of media noise and publishing hyperbole. Literary content of exceptional quality and production values, always hardback, equal to any in these islands. Apart from the issues of finance, the sole criteria for publication by the press are the distinction of the writing and the integrity and independence of the individual voice. Due to the challenges of the pandemic's first year, the Irish Pages Press opted for a publishing hiatus, from which it has emerged financially stronger due to further generous support from the 2 arts councils in Ireland, as well as the British Exchequer in May 2020. As a result, the press has now brought out 20 titles to date, with 8 more scheduled to appear over the next year. That will be the future annual pattern, along with the 2 biannual issues of Irish Pages, a journal of contemporary writing, 8 book titles, 4 in the spring, summer, and 4 in the autumn, winter. All poetry and nonfiction of various types, but no fiction will appear. So without further ado, for all lovers of Scots, Kathleen Jamie and Brian Holton. Thank you very much.
Is that mic? We don't know. And the record. Do we need to go to the microphone? So I'll have to be jumping back and forth. That's very annoying.
Well, what do we do if we want to have a conversation?
That's what we do.
There we go.
So we sit in these.
Isn't technology fabulous?
Now, Brian here is going to do most of the talking in 1, 2, probably 3 languages, and I'm just going to encourage that. You didn't know that, did you?
I didn't need much encouragement,
so,
to tell you the truth.
I'm trying to think when I first became aware of Brian's work in Scots, and I think it was possibly through this book, which was published a few years ago. Work in Scots translated from the Chinese, or from classical Chinese, and I was just staggered that such a person existed who could do this, and work with classical Chinese and modern Chinese and bring it into Scots, not via English, just through his own natural Scots. And I thought, there's this guy, So having been aware of this book, which I kept about my person for quite a long while, it's a bit bent, when Chris of Irish pages said, do you know anybody in Scotland who's working on anything that might interest us? I was could have been a sort of talent scout. And I said, well, you know, because Chris is so hospitable to Scots and to other minority languages in these islands, I said, well, you know, have a look at this. So they've made this gorgeous book. I mean, it's, look at that, isn't that beautiful, you know? And Brian here will tell us, I hope, that this was his lockdown project. I was mucking about with banana bread, you know. He was translating Chinese texts of 1,000 years ago into this gorgeous Scots. Just read it. I mean, you can read that, can't you?
Mm.
Can you read that?
There's maybe, what, more than how many billion Chinese that read better than me?
But they're not here.
No, there's even bairns can read that. Well, actually, that's kind of enjoined up writing. So I'll tell you what, I'll read the poem it came from, if you prefer.
And you can look at this. So you just pulled this text, a book, off your shelf that had been there for however long, and thought, right, today's the day I'm going to start translating this because I've got nothing else to do.
Well, you can.
And this is classical Chinese, is it?
It is classical Chinese. It's quite vernacular in some ways because it was song lyrics. Do we need to bring this a bit closer? The mic a bit closer? We'll get all these wee things sorted out first. Is that better? Right. Now, classical Chinese covers several thousand years. It goes right back to the earliest texts, which are about 3,500 years ago. Although Chinese people don't like me saying this, the very earliest, Jiagu Wen, the oracle bone script, there is no proof at all that the language that was used for that writing was Chinese. That writing system was developed and inherited, and it's still the same system used in China, but we do not know what it sounded like back then. So, you know, right.
But very long ago.
But very long ago. Classical Chinese is, if you think of the difference between Italian and Latin, there's some evidence, well, again, if you go back to the time of Confucius, 700 BC, it's possible that that was never a spoken language, that the form that was written down was never a spoken form, but only used for writing. Again, it's one of these things we don't really know, but you can spend your life poking around at that sort of thing. It's a gorgeous language to actually write yourself, you know, the elegance of it. We have nothing like that. There's a very famous poem from about the 9th century by Li Xiaoyin, which is described as gloomy and damp. It never actually uses, and chilly, it never actually uses any of these words, but it uses quite a lot of characters that have got the element, the sandy and shui, the 3 drops of water, which don't necessarily mean the word has got anything to do with water. It may have at one point. But just that graphic element can give an overall tone, which alphabetic languages can't do. On the other hand, Chinese doesn't mark tense, number, gender, definiteness. There are no articles. It doesn't often, there's no declension, no conjugation, no marking of singular or plural. And on top of that, classical Chinese leaves out pronoun subjects and pronoun objects. So who is doing what to whom and when is often a wee bit tricky. So it's like every pronoun in this book is, or almost every pronoun in this book is conjectural. So you have to you can make up your own story. You join the dots, you know. I might make an elephant, you might make a giraffe, but it's the same poem. There was no thing, you know, Wordsworth thing about a man speaking to other men. How poetry in Europe descended from either the Greeks, where the god was speaking through the poet, or the Hebrew prophets, who were inspired again by it. Nothing like that in Chinese. There are shamanistic poems from 2,000 years ago. Truths, for instance, the Songs of the South. But really, it's a different thing altogether. It's more horizontal, it's mind to mind, rather than public address and finger wagging, which I love.
It's very difficult to understand if you're not immersed in it.
Well,
How can
it's
you have a
easier if you're
language that has
Chinese.
none of those features? What remains?
Well, the word order is the same as English. I go Beijing. I tomorrow go Beijing. I yesterday go Beijing. Right? That's how it works. But adverbs rather than conjugation. I mean, you can mark all of these things if you want to, but you don't have to. And the classical language, you rarely do. So, well, you know, I used to say to my students when I was a teacher, I'm a recovering academic, but I used to say to them, look, if you do something for 40 years and you didn't get good at it, you've got to ask yourself some hard questions. It's like, you know, the old story, the boy with the violin case says to the old fella, how do I get to the Albert Hall? You know what he says? Practice, practice, practice. 滴水传世. Dripping water penetrates stone. Or as an old diker said to me once in the Ettrick Valley, he said, "Good time, son. You can pish a hole in a stain in time." That's the secret. So, are you? Oh.
Obviously, you studied at university. What gave you the notion to study Chinese in the first place?
Well, I was doing classics, Latin and Greek.
At university?
At Gala Academy, which was one of the very few schools in Scotland at the time in the 60s where for hire we read the English stuff, but our teacher Donald McInnes, who was a wonderful man, a Skye man, he had us reading everything from the Makars, all Scots literature in Scots, right up until living poets at the time like Hugh MacDiarmid and Garioch and folk like that. So that, I was very lucky that way, and that was when I tell the story in that book actually. I was about 15, 16, I was standing outside the cafe in Selkirk with my girlfriend, my first girlfriend, Cathy Coburn. Oh, she had green eyes. And then our cousins came by, it was summertime, and he says, "Are you going swimming down at the Scares the morning?" And a penny dropped, because I was doing French, which gives you an insight into how modern English developed. And I was doing Latin, which shows you where French came from. French is bad Latin spoken by Germans, essentially. And I was doing Greek, which showed where some Latin came from. And a penny dropped that Scots wasn't bad language. It wasn't just bad English, as our teachers most our teachers had told us. And I started listening, and sadly my great aunt was gone by then, my Auntie Kate. And Kate was right broad. She cried as Brian. And my brother was Herfy, Brian, Herfy. And he didn't hear the one kind of broad border tongue, say muckle nowadays. The bairns in Golly soon like they come from Trinent. The isogloss has moved south. The border was always between southern and midland Scots, was always between about Cloven Fords and Peel Hospital, but it's now between Lindeen, between Gala and Selkirk. So, you know, the only languages that didn't change are Deegians. But when I heard that, "Are going swimming at the Scares the morning," that got me going, and I started listening to my granny.
Uh-huh.
Now, how many teenagers listen to their grannies?
No, I did.
And then I had a mad headmaster. McElwraith was removed a year or two after. My younger brother Norman, both my brothers are gone now, but Norman was expelled from school for skiving off a cross-country run in winter. My twin brother Harvey was expelled because he was smoking. He was caught smoking. These weren't. And then he tried to expel me. My mother complained to the education committee, but she was a single parent. And after I was gone, he turned his attention to the next single parent family.
No.
So, but he belonged to something like the Primmer's Brethren or something like that, and he was forever pushing extreme right-wing literature at us, moral rearmament, shit like that. But he would bully me. Because I was good at Latin and Greek, I was going to be a minister. And I had to say, look, we're excused religious observance. I was brought up a socialist. But he wouldn't have it, couldn't he see it? Mm-hmm. And I read in the Scotsman one day, what happened, I'd read Arthur Whaley's History of the Opium Wars, and I was really angry that we'd never been told about that at the Skill. And as I was putting the book back, next to it I saw 170 Chinese poems, and I was reading poetry in French, in Latin and Greek and everything I would find. never occurred to me that Chinese folk wrote poetry. And yet, two of my great uncles on my mother's side had been engineers with the Ben Line that sailed the big ships to Hong Kong, Canton, Shanghai, Yokohama. So the house, my granny's house, was full of Chinese stuff. But it never occurred to me, Chinese write poetry. And then, it seems like instantly, but it must be a wee while, the Scotsman had a wee paragraph, 1966, saying that Edinburgh was opening a Chinese department. I thought,
Just like that.
Just like that.
That's the thing for me. That's
That's
wonderful.
it,
So you're absolutely primed for it by when you saw that.
Well, I'm good for nothing else now.
No, in the context, we get the impression of a international family or multilinguistic.
Aye,
and a school, for heaven's sakes.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, you see, I mean, we grew up in, my brothers and I, in Nigeria. My parents were about 12 years in Nigeria. Dad spoke Hausa. They'd been in the north before we were born. And we spoke Pidgin English. I found a wonderful sentence in Pidgin English, in Nigerian Pidgin. There's a dancer speaking. You go feel 'em, you know they go talk 'em. If you feel it, you don't have to say it. Isn't that wonderful? So, yes, I grew up with them.
So from there, it must have taken many years of study and scholarship before you were even able to do this kind of work.
Well, I'm a slow learner.
You reckon?
I'm a slow learner.
No, for heaven's sakes. Could you give us a flavour of one of the poems?
Aye.
Of your choice? We're saying these works are 1,000 years old?
Aye, round about. The earliest this is the anthology is chronological. It's an anthology designed for students who've not read this kind of poetry. 宋字三百首.
A school book?
More or less. I had a wee bit of criticism online a while ago, but I should be using a more scholarly edition. But the book I'm using...
find things to get in it.
But the thing is, I'm no talking to scholars. Folk who can read Chinese didn't need me, And the book is designed for students who've never read this, so it's perfect, really, for my purposes. The 10th century onward, for a couple hundred years, the Song dynasty.
So to be clear, we have a schoolroom anthology for kids nowadays to use, which features poems of 1,000 years ago, and the contemporary school kids would be familiar with work of 1,000 years ago through this book, like our Golden Treasury or something of the sort.
Something like that. Right?
Yeah. Not that we still use that, I don't think, but that kind of idea. Every schoolroom would have had a copy of this.
Well, no every. I mean, it's not as popular or as widespread as Tang Shi Sanbai Shou, which is an 18th century anthology of Tang dynasty regulated verse, which every kid knows. The Chinese people are nodding there. You know that, don't you? Yeah. 你们都认识吧？哎呀，你都会说普通话吧？ Right, listen carefully, there'll be an exam later. 你们的苏格兰话怎么样？苏格兰话？没有啊。All right, okay, they've got no Scots well.
Oh, well, soon will.
You'll soon learn.
Would you read the Chinese and the Scots then for all the audience?
Aye. Now these are songs. It's not free verse. They're songs written to existing tune patterns.
Oh, we'll talk about the complexities of it in a wee minute.
In a wee minute, aye. So
mind-boggling.
This is Sheng Zhazi. This is by Zhang Xian, who's late 10th century. 含羞正催还，得意偏向故，眼住13线，一一春阴雨. You see the furrowed brows. This is a written language. It's not easy to understand when you hear it like that, is it? 教云容易飞，梦断知何处？ 深渊锁黄昏，阵阵芭蕉雨. Now that's not how it sounded like in the Song dynasty. That's how we sound it today. The Chinese writing system doesn't really give you a lot of idea. It's not phonetic, But anyway, to the air, the song tune, Caller Hawes. Blade like she fettles a cocker noonie. O sperky with jowls. Fair juckle she and aft keeks it is. 13 therms on wild goose zither trees, yin and by yin, wheeple the linty song. Sic a dainty cloud, will easy flee awa. Who kens where she'll be when my dreams devolve? The glowmans sneak it up in the how of the close, with a dreep of rain on banana leaves. It's that dun dun pa jiao yu, dun dun dreep dreep.
It's gorgeous.
There's only a couple of things because always it's what translators talk about prior text, what the audience brings, and in this period, Chinese culture was really set the Yellow River, and the south was kind of strange. If your home was the mulberry tree, silkworms, which every farm had, and bananas were exotic and strange, so there's a sense of being far from home here. Right.
Gorgeous. Who wrote that?
Zhang Xian, I don't think we know an awful lot about him. Well, he passed the highest level civil service exam at 41. Most of his poetry is lost, and most of his prose. He was praised by and associated with some of the greatest literary figures of the age. That's a bit.
That's all we know.
Some of these poets we know very little about. Some we know everything.
Right, I'm going to try and get the hang of the complexities of these. We have here a body of poems written mostly by men, I think. Men who were often in the civil service, sent far from their hometowns. So they're often far from home, writing poems of longing and of homesickness, these poor lads. And they're not poems, they're song lyrics. So each would be set to a tune. A preordained didn't write their own tunes, they set them to pre-existing tunes.
Mostly, hi.
Right, so you have a tune, you think, I'm going to write a poem that fits that tune. Yeah? Tell me about the complexities of the poem itself.
Well, I'll give you an example of the process. You don't use the word xie to write, you use the word tian, fill in, because you're filling in the metrical pattern. And Matthew Fitt did this back in the 80s. And he had a song where he used the metrics of the Led Zeppelin song. His poem is called Stairway to Eden. See, say all the miners that dirt at the heart of the yard, they work the hail next through to Eden. Sign there's a hole in the left at the end of the shift and they're working a back shift to Eden. That's exactly what you do here. You take an existing pattern and you write words that you fill it in. Chinese poetics isn't based on length, like classical poetry. It isn't based on stress, like English poetry. It's based on pitch. Now, that's to say every vowel in modern standard Chinese and Mandarin has got a fixed pitch contour. So you've got ma, 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 which are as distinct as mad, map, mac, mat, to the art of the Scottish here. And these are divided into level and oblique. But there's a wee bit of long, short here. Anyway, it's something, a non-tonal language, like Scots or English. Europe is the odd man out. Most of the native languages of South and North America, or many of them, particularly North America, and many of the African languages are tonal. But we are just odd in Europe because we're not.
And a poet also, furthermore, there were how many forms?
Oh, well, I think there's about 800 or so available. But I mean, that's like saying, how many words are there in the Oxford English Dictionary? How many people ken them all?
So, but
or the child,
a jobbing poet would know several.
He would know a good few dozen. I would have thought at least.
Forms.
Yeah. If you think again, the child ballads.
Yes.
There's no a singer born that kens all the songs.
Yes.
Yeah, they'll have their favourites and so on. So
Right.
didn't he be feared?
I just mortified. I mean, turning a sonnet is difficult enough, and I've only got very few types of sonnet. But what did you say? 600, 800?
Something like that. Yeah. Well, it's a choice, It's a pattern, and very, very few poets. There's one or two. I'm working on one now. Zhou Baiyan. who's a later poet. I'm working on a follow-up. Zhou Bangyan was famous for either codifying and setting the rules, because the earlier poets were a bit loose about the metrics, or for inventing patterns of his own. So, I mean, the greatest, this is called ci, which means lyrics or words, that's Zhou. And the greatest ci poet of our lifetimes is Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. Yeah, so it's not by any means a dead art. It's still on the go. Want another poem?
Yes.
Right, you've been told.
Do people want an English translation as well? Yes.
All three. For a Scottish
Oh, well. Well, in that case, I'll no do the Chinese, because it would just take her long. You want the English first or the Scots first? Don't mind, right?
Yeah, I want all three.
Well, I have to
Okay.
choose
Do we
short.
want all three languages? Yes, we do. Sorry.
Well, some of this is a bit difficult, because I translated some of these 2-3 years ago, and it contains vocabulary that I might not recognise, and because it's not phonetic, I might not know how to pronounce a particular word, you see.
Gosh.
So it's not as easy as that. But we'll do this. 最蜕变 is the 双蝶绣罗裙，动翅远处相见，微分珠分不胜韵，鲜花淡淡春。细看处处好，人人都留摇身。昨日乱山昏，来世一山云。And the English for that, to the air of drunken falls the whip. Now just don't even go there. This is not a Benny Hill show. We don't know what that means. It's a song, but everything else is lost but the title and the pattern. Skirt embroidered with 2 butterflies. The party at the eastern pool when first I saw her. Rouge and powder not too thick laid on, a wildflower, pale and fine in the spring. I got a good look, and she's lovely in every way. They all said her waist is willow slim. Last night, in unsettled mountain twilight, she came, all clad in clouds. Now there is an erotic subtext here. Spring has erotic connotations. Spring paintings are dirty pictures. And clouds and rain is a kenning for having sex, because of an ancient king who was benighted on a mountain on his own, and the mist came down, and this beautiful woman came and intermitted with him all night. And as she was about to leave in the morning, he asked her name, and she said, "I am the morning clouds and the evening rain." So clouds and rain is shagging.
But much more delicate.
But much more delicate, yes. Well, I don't know. I've only read a bit of books myself. So, foo faws the whip. Skirt flirt with 2 butterflies. The foy at the eastern pole when first I saw her. Rouge and powder, no hour thick laid on. A wild flower, pale and fine in the spring. I got a good look, and she's braw and elky way. Aubrey said, her middle's as jimp as a soch. Yestreen and bruckle hell gloamin', all clad wi' clouds she come. Which is the title of the book.
Aye.
A word from our sponsor.
Do you think there's something about the content of these old poems that go so nicely into Scots?
That's the thing I've wondered about a lot. I've wondered about this. I had a point after I graduated in Chinese. I had in the 70s unemployment, you know, the Thatcher economic experiment years, and I spent a lot of time in libraries. And I read all the Scots Text Society volumes, even the Lives of the Bloody Saints, and I'll tell you that was hard work. I just couldn't stop. And then I fell in love as an undergraduate with Shui Hu Duan, The Water Margin. The great novel of outlaws and bandits, which was the first masterpiece to be written in vernacular Chinese. And I tried to translate, and I couldn't make it work. And I'm sitting with my first wife in our wee cottage in Gartenside by the Tweed, you know, across the water from Melrose, one night, and moaning about it. I couldn't get it. Well, she said, for years you've been writing in Scots. How no trying in Scots? I said, well, I've never written, and I've never written in Scots, never crossed my mind. Like most Scots, most of us are illiterate in Scots. We'll maybe speak it, but we didn't read and write it. At least I was lucky I was taught to read it, but I'd never written it. So I sat down at my typewriter. Children, do you remember typewriters? Tap, tap. And the first chapter just fell off the typewriter, or the first half of the first chapter. And I sent it to my teachers, John Scott and Bill Dolby in Edinburgh. Bill Dolby translated Dad Edging into Welsh, he was, among other things. So he got so excited, he ran next door in Buccleuch Place in Edinburgh, and he ran up the top of the stairs where St Crastus had their office. And Glenn Murray went, yes, I want that. That was my first draft.
Oh, very good.
And it went into print. So that was me. Fame and fortune, well, no, it didn't happen.
Did you do the rest of the book?
No, I did about 10%. It's 70 chapters long. It would be longer than the Bible. It'd be the longest translation ever done into Scots. I tried for years and years. I think the last try was the mid-90s. I couldn't get a publisher to take it on. I even tried the idea of doing it and, be the first in the block to get this comic book, buy a set and things, and nobody would take it on.
But these have changed days.
Changes now, but 1983 I was told there's no market for Scots, and then the Lorimer Bible came out.
Yes.
Now, I understand my work isn't the Bible, but that went through 5 editions in 6 months, something like that. But still there was. So
would you go back to it?
No. I've tried in the past 10 years ago, maybe I had another shot at it. But a few years ago, I sold all my manuscripts to the University of Oklahoma, who have a collection of translators' papers. So that pretty much, I thought long and hard whether I was going to keep, I called it Mossflow. Mossflow. Men of the Moss Hags, the Crockett novel about,
what a loss. No.
Okay, well, you never can.
No, you don't.
Never say never. But it was at that time of my life, And right now, I translate Yang Lian. I've just got another Yang Lian book out in the spring there. I've been working with him for 30 years. Like I said to somebody earlier on, we're the Morecambe and Wise of the Chinese poetry world. So that and this keeps me just quite busy enough.
Still, that's our loss, I think.
Well, never mind. There's still about, I think, seven chapters appeared in various magazines. It's 10% of the book. So,
an abridged edition, like the Reader's Digest.
The Reader's Digest version, yeah. Well, so if there's any publishers tonight,
So what got us onto that was the question of whether there's some affiliation between the Scots language and the Chinese, or the content of them.
I don't ken, really, whether it's me or where it comes from. You can, when you find something and it speaks to you and it speaks through you and you become larger through it. Doesn't matter what it is. It might be painting a picture or playing the guitar or, you just find something. Well, I found something. When I was starting with the Mossflow, it was a very big book, I started playing with some of my favourite poems I'd learned as an undergraduate to see if I could do them. And I found I could into Scots. So these were kind of exercises. And that other book, Stan in my Lane, has got some of these early exercises. A 35-year work in that book.
Slim volume. This is also gorgeous. Another poem.
Another poem. Right. What will we do this time? We've done the bananas.
You said to me one time you couldn't find, you had to go with bananas, you couldn't find some way of naturalising that. Into
I naturalise a lot of things. Yeah. For instance, I translate place names because people who speak Chinese, they know Dongting Hu, they know what that is. Changjiang, they know what that is. They don't. But people like you who speak Chinese don't need me. The people who read this book, if you go Dongting Hu, that's just like going in the middle of the line. It has no content. It has no semantic content and weight. And some of my place names might sound a bit like Tolkien or the Norse sagas, but that is better than having nothing at all. Any connotation is better than no connotation. Because, I mean, Bill Herbert said a really lovely thing about the other book, W.N. Herbert. He said it makes you, it's like science fiction, you know, or fantasy, it makes you wish this could have happened. That these great poets could have spoken Scots. You know, and it's like I'm creating a parallel universe here, where these great Chinese poets speak and sing in Scots. I'm not going to attempt to sing any of these. I know somebody who can, though. You know, the level and oblique tones, level tones are long and oblique tones are short. So in a line with ping, ping, za, za, ping, it would be ping, ping, za, za, ping. Wouldn't it? See, you know about that. There's a small person smiling. So, right, another one. This is by Ouyang Xiu, who is one of the great men of the day. 1007 to 1072. He was a pioneer epigrapher, critic, writer, politician. He was one of the great voices of the day. I'm not going to give you the Chinese. I'll give you the Scots first. This is to their Speak Your Mind. The hingers were rowed up in the small oars with cranrach on them. She was blowing on her fingers to fettle her paintry. She was hert sair at her cindering. So she painted her brows long and high as the Ferrawa hills. Thinking now on times bypast, a rue for days long syne, and I easy get mistempered. She'd had back first, afore she sang. Going to smile, she'd prune instead. Dawn's what breaks a heart maist of all. In English, the blinds were rolled up in the small hours with hoarfrost on them. She was blowing on her fingers to fix her makeup, all heart sore at her parting. She painted her brows long and high as the faraway hills. Thinking now on times past, a rue for days long ago, and easily get ill-tempered. She'd hold back first before she sang. Going to smile, she'd frown instead. That's what breaks her heart most of all. Isn't that just, it's like a wee thumbnail, you know? You could make a movie out of some of these poems, because it's less is more. Multum in parvo, as the Romans used to say, much in little. And, you know, Chinese poetry, you know, the missionaries in the 19th century said that classical Chinese was terribly ambiguous, that you couldn't make, but you can make perfectly precise statements. This was bollocks, because they were semi-literate. But multiple meanings were prized. There's another form, the regulated verse. The great 17th century critic, Jin Changtan, a hero of mine, he said, the shortest form, the Juju, is 2 couplets, but he said there's a third couplet which can only be supplied by the reader. Isn't that a beautiful idea? You know, the job of the poet is to get you imagining, to take you places you wouldn't go on your own, and find yourself emotionally, philosophically, sometimes even, you know, meditatively in a new state. Because this comes out of a world, I mean, this is the closest you will get to speaking to an alien until we learn to speak to whales and octopuses. I suspect we'll learn quite a lot about fish if we do that. But these people from pre-modern China, these people operated along different principles. Even if you're Chinese now, you don't come out of the same culture and mindset. For instance, for them, until 1911, the end of empire, the I Ching was the central book of the culture, the book of change, which states there is only one constant on this earth, and that is change. But change is always and everywhere the same, and it can be mapped. Now, that is completely different to the linear time of the religions of the god of the desert, you know, where time is started by God and finished by God. Chinese wasn't like that. It takes us hard work. It was also a culture that for 2,000 years was very strongly Buddhist, so meditation was central. It was also a culture that was, you were a Buddhist on high days and holidays, weddings and funerals. You were a Confucian in the office, which was about management consultancy, you know, how groups can work without friction. That's what Confucius was about. And you were a Taoist at the weekend, you know, going with the flow. round the mountains. There is actually, from the 3rd century BC, Needham's Science and Civilization in China has a description of how to fly from a Taoist text. Now, it describes a small room, and you see in great detail and you sweep it out, and then you get this kind of sensor, and you fill it with a pinch of this and a pinch of that and 1.5 pounds of cannabis leaves. And then you set fire to it, and you sit 2 feet in front of it, and you do your breathing exercises, and it says, you will fly. So it's a different culture altogether, even for modern Chinese people. So we have to do this act of imagination, just as we do with fantasy or science fiction. We have to imagine ourselves into a parallel world. That's part of the joy of it. But as they very kindly put on the back of the thing, what I wrote there, love, loss, parting, heartbreak or yearning are universal, for we are one species. No matter how different our languages, how far apart we are in time and space, how different our language and cultures, our hearts all resonate to the same frequencies. That's why this poetry works. It crosses time, it crosses frontiers, and it can speak to us. But Chinese persons, you'll have to learn Scots, mind. Right. It's difficult to stop me something.
And there's about 5 things I want to follow up on. One is, it speaks, it goes beautifully into Scots in your hands, but also into a modern sensibility, despite what you've just said about being alien. I think this is a very modern kind of poetry.
Yeah. Well, the job of a translator is only secondarily about the language. It's about the culture, about moving behind the language, the impulse that led the writer to make marks on the page. The first thing I have to do with the text when I start working on a poem is I have to figure out what it might mean. So dictionaries. I often use, the thing I discovered a good few years ago is Chinese-French dictionaries. I bought, when it came out, the Grand Ricci. The Jesuits did a 7-volume Chinese-French dictionary, which allows me to leapfrog English, because it's much easier to go from French into Scots.
Oh gosh!
I didn't know that; it just happened to me. I spent €700 on that when I was in Hong Kong. It's beautiful, leather bound. Each volume has 3 bookmarks in it. These guys knew how to make a dictionary. They did it, and it started in the 40s, and they did it in Latin, Chinese Latin, Hungarian, German, English, and French. But the French government, in about 20 years ago, ponied up to have it printed. €700 I spent. And then 10 years ago, I discovered an app on my iPad where I got it for 35 quid.
It's rankled with you.
Which is wonderful, I'm not complaining. The batteries never run out on the original, mind.
So you've got that great dictionary, and we have, thank God, the dictionary of the Scots language as well.
Oh, aye.
Do you use that?
Oh, aye,
Good.
yes, all the time.
Thank goodness for that.
I mean, there can't be a writer born, never mind translator, that doesn't use dictionaries. You've got
I think so. It's like plumber uses spanner, it's just
exactly
what you do.
You've got to graze on them, you've got to know which tool for which job, and it's a joy and a delight. And of course the internet just makes it so easy. Some of you children will not remember the days when if you wanted to find something out, you had to get up off your arse, get on the bus, go to the library, walk around the library until you found what you wanted,
It's true, but you'd often find something else more interesting while you were about it. Serendipity's gone, I think, from internet searches.
Yes, that's called a library angel. There are angels in libraries,
Give us another wee poem, and then I'd like to talk about using Scots in a modern Scotland.
A wee note in this one. This is Lin Jiang Xian. Now the word Xian, which is a picture of a person next to a mountain, Chinese people insist on translating that as fairy, and that is completely and utterly wrong.
You tell.
The European fairies were either fallen angels or they were a separate order of creation. God made angels, he made fairies, and then he made humans. Now, the Xian is a person who, through fasting and meditation and various other practices, becomes not immortal, but very long-lived for centuries. They do it in the mountains because the qi, the energies, are stronger there. And it's bedeviled me for years how to find a good translation. Paul Kroll has a very good dictionary, student's dictionary of classical Chinese, and he suggests transcendence, which is quite good because there are people who've transcended the lifespan. But I've put that in as a placeholder. I've used the Scots transcendence. I suppose I better give you the English first. Now, naturally, the title has got that's the pattern. It's got nothing to do with the content. Shut in the high loft and wakened from dreams, I sober up from the drink and pull the bed curtains low down. That spring trouble from years ago is back. Somebody standing alone among falling flowers as swallows fly in pairs through the fine drizzle. I remember when I first got together with little Clover, a singing girl. She wore a flimsy gown with twin curlicue collars. On the lute string she spoke of true love. And bright was the moonlight then, like it shone from the clouds when she went. And it was a lute. Pipa is derived from a Central Asian instrument. When it went to the Arab world in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, it was called al-oud, the oud, which they still play. And when it went to Europe after the Crusades, which is about the time of these poems, it became called the lute. It got fat in Europe, and it got Baroque style, as many as 19 strings. In China, when it got the other end of the Silk Road in China, it got slimmed down and only 4 strings. But it's the same instrument, organologically. One of the famous instruments here, the scholar's instrument by par excellence, is called the qin, which is a flat horizontal harp affair. Like a sometimes it's translated as zither, but I often translate it as clarsach. It's not the same instrument, but it had the same position in society. The clarsach in Highland society was an aristocratic instrument. So you see some of the things that we have to do to cross boundaries. And anyway, you want this in the Scots. Waterside transcendence. Steek it in the high loft and wakent for dreaming, a sober up for the drink. And pull the bed curtains leich down. Yon spring fashery a years by gain is back. A body standing our lane among fawn flowers, as swallies flee and twasomes through the small rain. I mind when I first forgathered wi' wee Suki. She wore a flindrican goon with double perlicue collars. On the lute's therns she spark a hair lichen, and bricht was the minlicht den, like it shone for the clouds when she gaed. It would bring a tear to a glassy.
I think they work because they're so packed full of nouns and things, and no
Nouns and things.
Yeah, and despite your transcendence, there's no abstractions in them, and not much. Yeah. Yeah. Not much in the way of metaphor, not much simile even.
There is and isn't. But the other thing that doesn't come across in translation is they're absolutely packed with quotations. And allusions. Now, and that simply doesn't come across. I mean, I could put footnotes in and say this line is a copy of this line by another poet you've never heard of. Right. You know, I mean, what good does that do the reader? So an awful lot I just have to pass over. Things like clouds and rain. As I said earlier, the fact that that's a metaphor for sex, that doesn't really come across much. And there's an awful lot of stuff like that because Chinese history, how many of us know anything about Chinese history? And who were the great heroes and who were the villains? Who was the most beautiful woman? With one glance a city fell. If she turned her shoulder for a second glance, a kingdom toppled. Qing Guo. Han Huang Zhong Se Si Qing Guo. It's another famous poem from another time, which doesn't translate easily.
So women are often mentioned, but you're pretty sure that none of these are written by women?
In this particular, there are some. I mean, that banana one, earlier on, there is a very famous later poem which was attributed to Lu You, who's a very great poet from 100 years or so later, although some authorities say it wasn't written by him. It was written by his girlfriend, whose name is lost. Her name, Zhilun, was Ba Qie, the concubine from Sichuan. And that begins, 知知没上臭，不知臭来路。窗外有芭蕉，阵阵黄昏雨。That's beautiful. See, they're nodding there. Many Chinese people know this. Oh, I ken that sorry's on my brow. The road that sorrow came, I didn't ken. Outside the windy, bananas grow, dreeping in the gloaming rain. You see, the same elements are taken and mixed into something quite different. And that was a great thing, particularly with this kind of poetry, this period. You'd take a line and you'd, what do young people call it when you do that with music? Sampling, that's the word I'm looking for, thank you. Sampling when I was a laddie was something you did in biology labs. You see, the world changes. But that's exactly this sort of thing, you know, because these guys already, 1,000 years ago, they had 3,000 years of literature to draw on.
When did we become literate in this country?
Well, I suppose the post-Roman period, or the Roman period. There's the Yaristane in Yarra Valley, Liberalis, which looks like 5th century handwriting.
Okay.
But the first surviving document in Scottish history is the Inquisitio Davidi, which is the Latin survey of King David I before he came, when he was Prince of, was he Cumberland or Northumberland? Cumberland, yeah. It was a list of all these possessions. But that's largely because Edinburgh was burned, the abbeys were all burned, how many libraries were burnt, particularly in the rough wooing in the 16th century, you know. But, so, I mean, this poetry goes about the time they were building the abbeys in King David's time and founding the boroughs and going off on crusades. Some of these poems are in the voice of women. It wasn't new. Yeah, men had written with women's voices. Some of the poems, it's a male and a female. It's sometimes difficult to work out from the original text. You know, it takes a bit of puzzling that. Yeah.
Excellent. Have we got time to talk about Scots?
Aye.
And
what would you like to ken?
I would like to ken how to do it. I would like to ken how to do it without the ghosts of my shoulders going, that's not right speaking. You know, you'll never get on if you speak like that.
You'll never get on. Aye.
And what really bedevils me is that's an Ayrshire word, that's an Aberdeenshire word, and never the twain shall meet. Do you pay attention to that?
Well, I mean, I'll use words for dictionaries, like McDermott did. Hugh McDermott was a kind of cousin of my mother's father, Samuel McDermott Young. There's a whole long story that involves Sinclair's for Caithness and what's his name, David Dale, Robert Owen's place, and you know, other things like that. My cousin Kate at the back, she kens about these things. So buttonhole her later. I've forgotten.
I'm asking if you can put an Ayrshire word and an Aberdeenshire word in the same line.
Aye, but I'll look at, if I find a word in the dictionary that I've never used this, I'll use it because, remember, I'm trying to write a kind of verse here. So I'm looking for the pulse and the rhythm. And alliteration is very important since I haven't got pitch to play with. I use half rhyme, slant rhyme, alliteration, you know, all these devices, because without them, it's not a poem. It doesn't cohere. If it's just a set of lines, then it's just a set of lines. To be a poem, it needs to have a sound structure. And that's a tremendous constriction on a translator. Because if you translate form, if you privilege form, you lose content, and vice versa. But Scots gives us another. It's like, you know, it's like a pianist sitting down at a church organ. It's a whole range of different sounds. It's neither better nor worse. It's just different. It enlarges the soundscape that I can use. My father was Irish. My mother was border. My granny was she was a Ray for Wood Street in Galley, and my mother was a Young, and the Youngs were Selkirk originally, but round about Berwickshire. So, and then when we came back from Nigeria, we were in Edinburgh for a while, down in the colonies in Abbey Hill, and then Waverley Park, and then we went to Falkirk. And then we came back to Galley when I was about 13. And years later, my girlfriend said to me, because again, Falkirk, how they speak in Falkirk, it's not from the Moods, it's nearer Edinburgh as anything else. And me and my twin brother spoke like that. And years later, this lassie at Kent, I said, I mentioned this because it was a shock, because they were speaking broad Gauley again, the back of the throat, like that, half is slow. And she says, she said, we just assumed you had speech impediments. But somehow or other, it's like, I can't how I do it, to be honest. I learned to do it, partly was what I was learning at the skill, partly sitting in the library reading, and partly just listening. I mean, I worked in the mills, where I heard all sorts of things when I was at the skill, summer holidays, including the immortal line, "Thon's no a whirlybird, thon's a heli fucking copter." That was a man called Willie fucking Johnson. He probably had Tourette's, because folk would say, "Who are you doing, Willie fucking?" He'd say, "Oh, no fucking bad." He probably had some kind of Tourette's, but So, I mean, I grew up in a very rich linguistic environment.
It sounds like it. It sounds astonishing, yeah. You're not frightened of the word synthetic?
No. I mean, if you look at the Makars, the great poets of the Renaissance in Scotland, Dunbar and Henderson, they used Lothian Standard with tinges of their own local tongue. So some of them you can hear a bit of Aberdeen. Some of them you can hear a bit of the Borders. I mean, Gon Douglas has a wee bit of the Borderer about him in the Aeneid. So, I mean, I just stuck with that. Lothian Standard with Border tinges, and if I like it, I steal it.
Right. It's poet's prerogative. So.
It's a poet's prerogative, aye.
It gives one confidence, actually.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, if you didn't do it,
Well, it's just so.
you just have to jump in. And when you're young again, you didn't care any better. You do it, and then you realise how difficult it was afterwards. But it's just practice, and time.
Of course.
Would you like another one?
Yes.
I was going to say, I'll see if I can find you something cheerful, but no in this book. The next gin has got some cheery ones.
Are you working on the next lot?
Aye. Irish
How many of these are there altogether?
60.
And
300 in the
there's
book.
300 altogether in the original anthology.
Aye.
This is the first 60.
And Irish Pages has taken up the option on my next book. So I'm working about page by number 55. I've got the first draft done. The first draft of all 60, and I'm putting number 55 on the computer, which means revising it, doing a bit of research. And then I have to go back and do all but 3 or 4. I've got the English versions done. This one I did Scots and English together. This time I left the English, because I actually want to work more on the English. And it's like the French playwright Boileau in the 18th century. He said a work of art should be 6 months in the conception, 6 months in the execution, and 12 months in the drawer. If you walk away from it, Right. Anyway, Scots first. This is by Liu Yong, who was one of the great names. Oh, yes. See, the Chinese people have no name going, well, he's good. He is good, isn't he? Liu Yong. I'll tell you his dates in a minute. He was 987 to 1053. He was also famous as a musician. He was a magistrate. He spent his time in the entertainment quarter of the capital and was much admired by singing girls. Singing girls were professionals, musicians, poets in their own right. They were very high-class courtesans. Mandarins were not allowed to serve in their home province, and they were rotated every 3 years. This was to stop corruption. So there was all these effectively single men. So all these greeting for their lovers that weren't there. And China was a polygamous society, so a man could have as many secondary wives and concubines and temporary wives as he could afford. Personally, having been a husband, yen was enough at a time. So anyway, Liu Yong. Shan Yen Yo. Slows my pony on the old streets of Long Peace Tune. That's Chang'an, Xi'an nowadays. Long Peace Tune. High socks gain gate wheatland cherkers. I never knew there was a Scots word for cricket.
No.
Cherker. The setting sun ayont the Annie, hearth wind on the braes, and as far as I can see, a hingy lift in Elkie Eart. Clouds winnawa, and faint the height of them's left a hint. When'll the twae us meet again? Me, I'm out the way of the whoremongering. My boozy pals are few and far between. It's no like it was this year by past.
There's a fair bit of drinking in that book.
There is. Slow as my pony on the old streets of Long Peace Town. Tall willows crazy with chirping cicadas. The setting sun beyond the river island. Autumn wind on the hillside. And as far as I can see, a lowering sky in every direction. Clouds go and leave not a trace behind. When will we two ever meet again? Me, I'm not used to brothel visiting. Whoremongering is a much better word, isn't it? And boozy pals are few and far between. It's not like it was this time last year. I think that's the voice of a man, I suspect.
I think so. Will you take a couple of questions?
Yeah, certainly.
Would anybody like to ask anything of Brian here?
Arthur Whaley.
Yeah?
I met his grandson, or a relation.
Jonathan.
Only one fella, and he does geography in Sheffield or somewhere. And he's coming up to Edinburgh, so you and him, because he got me the Whaley literature coming out after his passing.
Hi.
Gave great. Whaley actually worked in intelligence gathering, so he had to translate, and he had great challenges. And it wasn't his first choice of the career, but he also then rolled on to Japan. And I would like to think in this library, I think we've got there's one or two beautiful slim volumes of his first 170.
Yeah.
And these would get anybody started, because you really want any poet with what the salt wants to jump pretty, where we presently are, and then keep your sanity and see if you can go right to another culture, turn yourself upside down. The other lovely thought I had once I heard about it, I talked about currently, this is a really cheeky one, Chinese and mainland China creative writing classes are sloshing with Chinese wine in order to get the inhibition pack, but people have to pass exams.
Yeah.
Just flush the inhibition through.
Yeah.
That's right. Out where the words come.
There's a wonderful 8th century poem by Li Bai, properly called Li Bo, but that's another story, called Tiang Jin Zhou, Bring Ben Booze. My teacher, John Scott, a wonderful, preposterous, outrageous, enraging, fabulous teacher, he met Arthur Whaley once. And Whaley didn't speak Chinese or Japanese or Mongolian, although he translated all of them. And he asked Whaley why he hadn't gone to China. And he said in his rather posh voice, well, the China I know is the China of the 8th century. I rather think it's changed.
Thank you. Anybody else? Robert?
Do you think there's a sense in which it's almost easier to recreate some of these Chinese songs and poems in Scots than in English, because there's so much that can't come over in the way of allusion that you mentioned, but nonetheless in Scots you can create a kind of acoustic density and interest which gets around the issue of so many English language versions of Chinese, and for that matter Japanese poems, seeming very, very flat.
Aye, that's right. Well, I discovered this when I was doing the Most Flow. That Scots, in some senses, a defective language, in that when the 1560, if Knox and Melville in the first book of Discipline had insisted on a Scots New Testament, things would have been very different. We would be much more like a wee place like Denmark, quite happy with our own tongue. But because they didn't, and they brought in the English Bible, so we lost over the centuries the ability to conduct high register discourse in Scots, and we used English in the church. I mean, I would never think of writing a job application in Scots, because we just don't do that. And this is what's so wonderful. But when you get into that, you have freedom. You have far more freedom in Scots. It's also, I mean, the wonderful thing nowadays, because Scots was, I mean, we always, don't get this wrong, we never stopped singing in Scots. We never stopped speaking in Scots. It became, I mean, as Professor Aitken said in the 80s, Scots became a language spoken by consenting adults in private. Which, for those of you who don't know, is the legal definition of homosexuality, between consenting adults in private. But what's happened informally in the pub, we never stopped using Scots. Scots has changed, of course. Nobody speaks like their granny. And the only languages that don't change are dead languages. But with the rise of informal media, texting, email, and so on, there's what my friend Tommy McClellan, who is the only other Chinese Scots translator in captivity. He doesn't publish very much, but Tommy calls it cyber Scots. And there is a tremendous increase in the use of Scots in informal media. So you never can what's round the corner. But I think Robert, I think the thing that liberated me when I started using Scots, apart from the fact that it matched the language of the original, was suddenly I was given this big toy box that I never had before, and it didn't have as many rules as English. Now, it's a historical novel, and Walter Scott defined the historical novel. You know, but that sort of sub-Shakespearean pish and tush and zoons, lads, you know. No, I couldn't do that. But going instead to the language of the ballads, that gave me something else. It gave me an in. And I think it's the freedom to construct some new dream, which is all we're doing as translators. We're dreaming a new dream.
Lovely.
Oh. You decide.
Yeah. These are old poems. Are there words, ideas that are not translatable?
Yes, there always are. There always are. Mostly it's allusions. Sometimes jiao is a real problem. That means alcoholic drink. Now, if you're like another book where I'm translating regulated verse, I'm looking for, say, 5 stresses to the line. So bring in the alcoholic drinks. It doesn't work, does it? There's a problem with the general and specific. Right? I mean, for instance, we have words for every noise every animal makes. Horses nicker and hui, bird, you know. In Chinese, the jiao. Or if you're feeling classical, ming. And that's really about it. That covers birds and animals and all noises. So there's also, I mean, one that really it's a big problem for modern Chinese, the word gua. Gua covers all of the melons and cucumbers and squashes and pumpkins. You can distinguish them. Huang gua, the yellow gua, is the cucumber. Hami gua, which is from the oasis on the Silk Road, is a honeydew melon, and so on. But that's a problem with any language, gaps, isn't there? Untranslatable. Often there are concepts, I mean, I talked about xian, the so-called immortals, you know. There are concepts that don't transfer, but you can usually find a finger post, and you can always put a footnote in. Yes, sir.
I'm just interested in the process of how you actually translate. Do you sort of read the poem, or do you look at the poem and then you go away and sort of think about the poem and talk about it
no, really,
to yourself in a sense, and then you go back to it?
Well, of course I do, but I mean, basically I open the book and I look at these funny Chinese scratches on the page and I try and figure out what it might mean. It's a bit like a mechanical engineer will look at the blueprint and say, well, how am I going to make this? And then my dictionary work. And by the time I've finished the dictionary work, I'm ready. I mean, it's better to let it lie maybe overnight. I usually do, of these poems, I do maybe half a dozen. And then I'll start writing out in Scots. First draft, always in the jotter. 20 years ago, I was at Chinese University in Hong Kong, where they have a collection of translators' manuscripts. And the head said to us, we've got a real problem now. Because even before computers, typewriters, carbon copies. But nowadays, nobody makes copies. You can't see the handwritten first draft that was typed up and then annotated, and the publisher's galleys and stuff. So at that point, I decided, so I started doing my first draft by hand. And then I collect, maybe half a dozen. put it on the computer, and then do an online search for the Chinese text, because that then gives me variants and it gives me different commentaries. Because the commentary in my textbook is very good, but it's for students. But online you often get, I mean, sometimes you get rubbish, of course, you know. Some optimist, I think it's Hugh McDermott, optimistically said that 75% of everything is rubbish. You know. But at least you get, look, and then I type it up, and that's when I start thinking about sound. And then I'll do a dozen, and I'll go back and think more about sound and revise and that. And then, of course, when it's time to do the book, I have to go through it all again and do that. That's how it works.
When you think about the music, I mean, you're saying that
Aye.
all these are,
Yeah.
you've got to think about the music.
Aye. Yeah. I had a very interesting experience 20 years ago. I was working with W.N. Herbert, the poet from Dundee. That's right, Stuart, I'm not going to make Dundee jokes, just a minute. But we were working together on an anthology of contemporary Chinese poetry. And he would come to my house, I was living in Whitley, and we'd sit there and look at my drafts, and he'd go, too many Fs. And that, I'd never thought like that. You know, that really made me focus more on sound. So say this time, the next book, I'm going to be focusing much more on making the English dance. The first book, that book originally was only prose. The original concept was just English prose glosses for the poems. But the publisher said, look, if you just tickle it up a wee bit, you've nearly got poems in English. So, yeah. Just one more from...
So you've worked with these texts from the Song Dynasty
Yeah.
and with the mystic powers of the 20th
Yeah.
century. What are the similarities and the differences between working in such different periods?
Dead poets don't give you a hard time. But on the other hand, you can't ring them up and say, what the hell did you mean by this? It covers it.
Here comes Chris.
I don't need a microphone. Thank you, Kathleen, for the perfect leading of that conversation. Thank you, Brian, for really unsurpassed genius and learnedness, both in speaking about translation as well as translation.
I think the technical term you're looking for is bollocks.
Is there a Scots equivalent?
Yeah, there is, but I'm not going to tell you.
You're not going to say.
It always strikes me that pendicles ought to mean that, but it doesn't.
Anyway, just to conclude, T.S. Eliot once remarked, for every 50 good poets, very good poets, there was only one very good critic. My friend Francis Jones, the great translator from Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, once said there was, for every very good 50 poets, there is at most one translator who makes it an art form. So Brian is a true artist and a true poet. That's clear from this book, which leads me, yes. 20 copies down there. I urge you to buy 2, of course, on the for lovers of Scots. Of course, you can order online. Plus, we have the current issue of Irish Pages, which includes the wonderful afterword. I won't attempt the Scots translation of that.
Our setters eke.
Yeah, and Kathleen's wonderful introduction to the book. So they're down there. Please help yourself. Have a few pounds ready. But I urge you to buy it for friends who love Scots, and perhaps libraries too. Thank you very much, you lovers of Scots who showed up on Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Cheers.
And finally, I would like to thank you all for coming, of course, but also for Chris and Kathleen for being so enthusiastic, and Chris for producing, and his team of superheroes for producing such a beautiful book.
Nice book.
You know, if you haven't seen it, it's got silver blocking, back and front. It's properly stitched. Smells good. Yeah. Okay, right.
Okay.